As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So most senior U.S. officials want to keep supporting the proxy war against Russia and are not looking for diplomatic off-ramps despite Ukraine's faltering counteroffensive. And this was reported by a Washington Post columnist, David Ignatius. So Ignatius, and this was published on Sunday, he's known to have, a lot of high-level sources in the government, especially the CIA. He's kind of considered the closest, when it comes to the columnists from the big papers, the closest to the CIA. That's what Scott Horton tells me, at least. But I just want to read this one excerpt from his article. It reads, quote, "I heard this same sentiment across all levels of the U.S. government in recent days. The summer has been frustrating and, in some ways, disappointing for Ukraine and its Western backers. But rather than look for a quick diplomatic exit ramp, most senior U.S. officials appear more convinced than ever of the need to stand fast with Kiev. The United States, in their view, cannot be seen to abandon its ally," end quote. So, despite this struggling counteroffensive, they're saying, he says most senior U.S. officials, which means, Blinken, Sullivan, and all their deputies, I'm sure, are all gung-ho about continuing this war as well. So this is interesting. Zelensky said on Sunday that Ukrainian elections could happen in wartime if Kiev receives funding from its Western backers and Ukraine's legislators are willing to hold a vote. So as I've covered, Zelensky previously said that elections could not happen because they're forbidden by Ukraine's constitution during martial law. And Ukraine recently extended martial law until November 15th. They have to extend it every 90 days. And Ukraine's next parliamentary elections are scheduled for October 2023. So that extension meant no parliamentary elections. And then the next presidential election is due to be held in March 2024. And, martial law is expected to be extended, for a while because there's no sign that this war is going to end anytime soon. So Ukraine's martial law prohibits men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country, and Zelensky has used these powers to crack down on opposition. He banned 11 opposition parties and nationalized the television media. So again, this is interesting because Zelensky made these comments in response to calls from Senator Lindsey Graham for Ukraine to hold elections in 2024. The Ukrainian leader acknowledged that his country could lose some Western support for not holding elections as the war is being sold as a battle to uphold democracy. So I kind of find this funny because, I've covered Zelensky saying there's not going to be elections, Ukrainian officials saying they can't have them under martial law, and just kind of for covering that news and pointing out that this is being sold as a war for democracy. I got just a lot of angry emails and things. One of the stories I think was reprinted on Zero Hedge, so they have a pretty huge reach. Kind of calling me an idiot for thinking that there can be an election and all this. And now here you have Zelensky saying that there could be an election, that they could change the law because Lindsey Graham is calling for it. And this is about maintaining support and maintaining the narrative that this is a war for democracy. So the commander of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said Sunday that the U.S. must challenge China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, which is an area that has become a potential flashpoint for a conflict between Washington and Beijing. So these comments came from Vice Admiral Carl Thomas, and they came after incidents between Chinese and Philippine vessels near a disputed reef known as Second Thomas Shoal. So Thomas assured that the U.S. would back the Philippines in the face of shared challenges and that 7th Fleet forces, which are based in Japan, are out here for a reason, as he said. He said, quote, "You have to challenge people, I would say, operating in a gray zone. When they're taking a little bit more and pushing you, you've got to push back. You have to sail and operate. There's really no better example of aggressive behavior than the activity on August 5th on the shoal," end quote. So Thomas made the comments while in Manila, where he met with the head of Philippine operations in the South China Sea, Vice Admiral Alberto Carlos. And, the reason why this is such a dangerous situation is because the U.S. says that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. So that means if this dispute between Beijing and Manila turns hot, that could mean the U.S. is at war with China. I mean, that's how serious this is. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and this is interesting because, the U.S. really wants to get this Saudi-Israel normalization deal. The Biden administration wants to clinch this before the elections, which I think is just unlikely, just not going to happen. I don't think either side is really going to go for it. Unless the U.S. gives them everything that they're asking for. The Saudis want a security guarantee from the U.S., Israel's saying that they want new security guarantees now from the U.S. And another thing the Saudis want is help developing a nuclear program, a civilian nuclear program. So what's interesting is that Saudi Arabia is now This is according to a report from Financial Times, but I think I've seen it elsewhere as well, that the Saudis are considering bids to build a nuclear power station from countries including China, Russia, and France, as the kingdom attempts to pressure the U.S. over a sensitive security pact. So again, this is just, I think the Saudis are, really trying to use their leverage with the U.S., and that has a lot to do with what they've been doing lately with China. They just normalized with Iran. Not saying, that they normalize with Iran to get leverage over the U.S., but I think they're going to use, they know that they have a lot of leverage over the U.S. right now. And even though, there's that report recently that said the Saudis were basically slaughtering Ethiopian migrants on their border, Biden's still looking to, give them these new security guarantees because they really want this normalization deal with Israel. I think they're going to be willing to look past a lot of things that the Saudis are doing. So it's just, and Saudi Arabia has been invited to join BRICS, which is a pretty big deal, considering that they're, the ones that back the petrodollar by trading all their oil with the dollar.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
It was something like that. Should we, because nobody was saying, should we go to war with China? But should the U.S. play an active role up to and including the supply of military resources in order to prevent this outcome?
Yeah, no, we shouldn't do that. And I think just as is playing out right in front of our eyes right now in Eastern Europe, we're much more likely to provoke the conflict that our government claims they're trying to prevent. In the case of Ukraine, they literally said, we are carefully calibrating the amount of weapons that we're pouring in so that it's the proper amount to deter Russia from invading without provoking them into invading. And then I even have quotes from the CIA officers who were involved in the arms transfers who complained to the press that, we told the bosses, we've calibrated wrong. We're provoking an attack here, but they wouldn't listen. So this is a government program, first and foremost. Once you have someone with a lobbyist and vested interest in selling F-16s to Taiwan, now the calibration has nothing to do with seeing the future in some State Department weenies crystal ball about what's the exact amount of weapons to calibrate. Instead, you have as though they could tell, like some Soviet commissar with a central plan. But then they have all these external incentives coming in, like massive corporations like Lockheed who want to sell ships to the Navy and want to hype up and fund all the think tanks that publish all the studies that say all this has to be done, and that mostly ignore the fact of nuclear weapons and seem to think that we could have a real fun Pacific War like during World War II with Japan, and it'll be great. And the thing about it is that people have just got to get acquainted with the geography here. And first of all, just for the sake of argument, let's say everything that he said there for his argument was right. We cannot defend Taiwan. So, it's 7,000 miles from San Diego. It's 90 miles from China. Imagine the Chinese Navy trying to come over here to the Caribbean to keep Cuba out of the hands of the Americans if they were intent on invading and conquering Cuba. It would make no sense whatsoever. They could not prevail in that circumstance. They could try, and they could die in a nuclear war with us, but at the end of the day, Cuba would not be in the hands of the Chinese. The same thing here. We could have a war and then still lose Taiwan anyway, but in the process lose half our Navy and hundreds of planes and possibly devolve into nuclear warfare. To go back to, there's a bunch of different ones there. First of all, it doesn't matter if they're a relatively democratic country or not, or land, not really country. It was a right-wing military dictatorship under American support for 50 years after independence or after the end of the Civil War there. It only became a democracy in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And even then, our Constitution delegates our national government the authority to provide or to guarantee a Republican form of government to every state in the Union, not every renegade province on earth. And if it does come to war, which all the think tanks have, done their studies and their war games, as well as the Navy has, about what it would look like. And almost invariably, they leave out even the existence of nuclear weapons because that would reduce the entire argument to already over. We can't have a war with China under any circumstances. It could go directly to H-bombs, and then we start losing cities. We can't have that. I mean, imagine China invades Taiwan, so we all agree to kill ourselves if they dare to do that. It makes no sense whatsoever. I interviewed Lyle Goldstein, and he was formerly at the Naval War College. He's now at Defense Priorities, which is a Koch-to-Puss thing, but they're really good guys. I got Daniel Davis over there. And Lyle Goldstein, he did all the war games and studied what war with China over Taiwan would look like for years as a professional there. And I think he's teaching at whatever university now as well. And I interviewed him for about an hour and a half about what war with China would look like. And it is really bad. I mean, he says we will lose half our Navy. We will lose thousands of sailors, hundreds of planes, and could very well lead to nuclear war. And not just the threat that China would resort to nukes, but the threat that the Americans would resort to nukes. Yeah. They start losing sailors by the thousands and these kinds of things. In fact, I talked with a guy at YAL Fest just last weekend, or weekend before last, who told me he was a submariner over there, and he could verify that the Taiwan Straits is shallow, relatively shallow waters, and we cannot dominate them with our subs. They had too many mines, too many boats. We cannot effectively wage a war there. It would be essentially committing half of our, military force to their deaths and then still lose. So that was the policy in Libya and Syria and Yemen, is, just back foreign terrorist shock troops to go in there and do suicide attacks and whatever. And then that way we can pretend that the war on terrorism is over because it's a war for terrorism now. And then nobody really gets all choked up if a Predator drone, runs out of batteries and falls out of the sky. You know what I mean? So they just keep it going forever. And then look at like the war in Ukraine right now. They keep saying, and I'm collecting these quotes like Matchbox cars for the book, that they just keep saying, man, this war is great. We are killing so many Russians, but it's not costing any American lives at all. In fact, David Ignatius in the Post was saying, we're all doing great from this war. And then he literally, Tom, put in parentheses, except for the Ukrainians.
Like an afterthought.
Yeah, dude. And that's the CIA. I mean, of all the guys at the Post, he is officially known as the man closest to the CIA there, former CIA employee, David Ignatius. And just, he's speaking for them. That's the way they look at it. It's like, into the meat grinder, young man. Back to the front.
So funny when people like that comment, like on Twitter, the responses are all contemptuous. And it just makes me wonder, how come we're not doing better if everybody who's even remotely conscious sees through these people? But that's a topic for another episode. I want to end by urging people to go, let's put our money where our mouths are. Oh, in a free society, we would freely donate to the... Okay, well, let's freely donate now, especially when it's a cause that generates results. Scott Horton is not driving around in a limousine. I can attest to that. He just puts his nose to the grindstone and works really, really hard for all of us. So let's do something in return for Scott. So libertarianinstitute.org/donate. I don't get any, I don't think I've gotten $1 from the Libertarian Institute, nor do I seek it. It's just, I know these people, known Scott forever, and I know they're doing good work. And I know there are people out there who would like to help something and they're not sure exactly what. Here's an example of what. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much, Tom.
The Peter Schiff Show. The point I'm making is, if we've got this growing economy, yet despite this growing economy, we are running budget deficits that are close to $2 trillion per year. Now, if we're running deficits of $2 trillion a year, when the economy is good, when it's growing, supposedly, what's going to happen during the next recession? I mean, we're going to have one. What's going to happen? Well, typically, budget deficits could double from expansion to recession when the Fed is supposed to be stimulating the economy. There were points in our past where Congress, at least gave lip service to the deficits to kind of make our creditors think that, okay, we're going to do something. There was some kind of plan that they would BS. And I always called them out on it and said, look, this is all BS. It's never going to happen because it's all about stuff that's going to happen in the future. But at least they pretended they were going to do something in the future. They stopped pretending. Nobody cares. I mean, the debt is on autopilot. And so the world knows this. And look what's happening. We're looking at what's happening in Jackson Hole. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, right, the BRIC nations are having a summit. They got more nations on board. Right now, they've got Saudi Arabia. They've got the United Arab Emirates. There's a few other countries. It's their influence is growing, right? And what do a lot of these nations have in common that are now organizing together? They are our bankers. They buy our bonds. They supply us with all of our stuff, right? They're our biggest suppliers and our biggest lenders. And what are they meeting about? They're meeting about not lending us any more money, not supplying us with any more goods. What are they talking about? In addition to expanding, right, their economic sphere, what do they want to make the centerpiece of this expansion? A new currency for global settlements that is not the US dollar. I mean, hello. I mean, how big a bell do they have to ring? And what are they talking about? What do they want to tie their new currency to, if not the dollar? Gold, real money. What does that tell you? The world is waking up. And it's not just because, we sanctioned Russia. I mean, that's part of it. But it's more than that. These countries, their leaders aren't a bunch of idiots. They don't want to go down with this ship. They don't want to have to keep accumulating dollars when they're going to just collapse in value. They can see that. They can see the runaway deficits, the complete lack of any fiscal discipline in Washington, or even lip service to fiscal discipline. We're still very arrogant. Everybody thinks, oh, America's this superpower, right? And it doesn't matter. We jump and the world says how high, right? We sneeze and the world catches a cold. That's not the way it is anymore. In that debate, I thought it was interesting because you have all these Republican candidates, and they're kind of arguing over, who's our biggest enemy? Is our enemy China? Is it Russia? They're not our enemies. We trade with them. They're not our enemies. Our enemy is domestic. It's not foreign. We're not at war. I mean, you say, oh, we're at some kind of a trade war or an economic war. No, we're not. I mean, does China have a desire to be the top economy? Sure. But to become the top economy, if we had a sound economy, that wouldn't lower our standard of living, because the way they would become the top economy is just to be even more productive. And to the extent that they're more productive, we benefit. So China's rise would lift all boats. Just like if you look at it from a economic perspective, right? You talk about, hey, when somebody gets rich in the private sector, in capitalism, they don't impoverish everybody on the way up. They lift everybody up with them. You get rich by satisfying other people's needs and desires, by making other people's lives better. And so we should all be rooting for China to be an economic success. It doesn't hurt us if China succeeds, right? That's maybe an arrogance or a jealousy, right? Just like I don't have to root for other businessmen to fail. I don't want, entrepreneurs to fail, right? Do you want the guy who's trying to cure cancer? Do you want him to fail? No, just because he's going to get rich. No, I want him to succeed because I don't want to get cancer, right? So I want people to get rich, making my life better. And if they happen to be in China, why should I care, right? I don't care if someone in China cures cancer. I just want it cured, right? I don't care if I have to pay someone in China. Now, would I rather pay somebody in America? Sure, but I'd rather get cured. And if it's China that's going to do it, that's fine with me. So we're not at war with China. Free people don't fight wars with one another. They trade with one another to mutual advantage. Governments maybe wage wars, but the private sector is not that foolish. But to try to figure out who is our enemy, right? Who is really a threat to our liberty and our prosperity? It's not China. I mean, how do they threaten us? Making us products that we want? I mean, maybe some people think, oh, TikTok, right? They're undermining us with TikTok. Well, if they weren't using TikTok, they'd be on some other thing. It's no different, right? That's not a war. Our enemies are the ones that have the power to harm us and who are using that power right now. And that's not China. That's not Russia. That's Washington. It's our domestic enemies that we need to be concerned about. That's what the Republican Party should be talking about. The threat coming from Washington, D.C., from the United States Congress, from the White House, from the Federal Reserve. Those are America's enemies because they are undermining our living standards. They are undermining our standard of living, our Constitution, our individual liberty, our prosperity, our posterity. I mean, you name it, they are undermining it. That's where the threat is. So we need to war against Washington. We need to war against this runaway, reckless federal spending. We need to war against the Federal Reserve that has been monetizing this debt and making it all possible.
The story is Biden, quote, likely to recommend everyone get new COVID-19 vaccine. I thought recently we announced it was gone. They had trouble announcing it when it came and how to define it and the proper treatment. They had to undo hundreds of years of medical knowledge in order to treat it poorly and prolong the agony. And somebody said, why would they do this? Why would they do this? And it is a difficult question because there are some like myself suspect that they had some evil motivation to do this and there was money involved. So who knows exactly because they're not going to confess, on what they're doing. But he wants to give it to everybody, even if they've had it and had the shots but it's a new vaccine because there was a new variant. And I was just mentioning to you, Daniel, that the variants could go on for a long time and scare the people. But the one thing is they have to build it up.
I think that's the characteristic of our era. They can't possibly, but they do. And so they can't possibly be resurrecting this Frankenstein monster, but they are. And let's put this from the Epoch Times. And they're just so shameless. Let's put this first one up. Biden is likely to recommend everyone get the new COVID vaccine. And he's asking Congress for more money because they need to get a new vaccine. And you might ask, well, doesn't that kind of an admission that the old one doesn't work? The one that everyone was supposed to have gotten and thankfully aren't getting? We'll put this on. This is the president himself explaining it to us in his own words. I signed off this morning on a proposal we have to the Congress, a request for additional funding for a new vaccine That is necessary. That works. Yeah, okay, all right. He said, while taking questions, and I would add this, while on vacation in Tahoe again. And he says, and tentatively not decided. Finally, yet tentatively is recommended. It is likely to be recommended that everybody get it, no matter whether they got it before. So he is asking Congress, I don't know how much it cost last time. I think it cost a lot of money to do the first one. Trump was involved in that. I wonder how much it's going to cost to do a new one. And if a Republican-led Congress will roll over and say, oh, okay, want some money? Here's some money.
You know, cost is being too generous, because cost indicates maybe they figured out what it would cost to do this and what is a fair cost, and it's been worked out in the market. But I think it's sort of insane obedience to what they're told, the people are told to do. And I think the situation right now, as it was through COVID, that it had essentially very, very little, and sometimes I thought nothing to do with medicine, good medicine. It was to undermine good medical practice. It was also unscientific, because it was challenging, natural immunity, and it's back to the age-old problem throughout human history: is who tells the truth, and how should we believe things? I was reviewing a little bit of our early history. The founders really argued over who's telling the truth. They got angry over it, and sometimes had duels over the whole thing. So figuring out the truth is a big deal. But I think that unfortunately right now it is prevailing that medicine, the medical part of the COVID, all the nonsense we hear has nothing to do with medical care, and they're rejecting science, and there's a lot of lies going on out there, and of course the people who are probably lying much less and the least are the ones who right now are being accused to be the liars.
Yeah. Take notes, but try to get it straight. An unnamed U.S. intel official talks to CNN and says an unnamed Russian intelligence agency, intelligence people, are affecting and influencing unnamed Americans using unnamed Russian cutouts as influence. This is just classic, where somebody said, somebody whispered. It's basically a CIA press release. Let's look at a couple of the quotes from this, because as you suggested a second ago, this is a classic case of projectionism. Our spooks are accusing them of doing exactly what we've been doing. Not we, but the CIA. U.S. intelligence agencies believe that the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, is attempting to influence public policy and public opinion in the West by directing Russian civilians to build relationships with influential U.S. and Western individuals, then disseminate narratives that support Kremlin objectives, obscuring the FSB's role.
Well, there are a lot of things that influence it, and I think that, the one thing that we should pay attention to is, how does this all get started, and how did we drift so far away from the principle of a republic to get to where we are? Well, it has something to do with the control of the university and the whole educational system in this country by our government. There's a way that they can propagandize and instill many of these beliefs. And it's also this notion that corporatism is soft communism and soft fascism, and it's not so bad. And then you end up with these FBI working with social media and conspiring against the people. And that's supposed to be good and healthy.
But there really is a sinister element to this, because we know that they're trying to put Trump in jail for going outside the official narrative about the elections. Whatever you think of Trump, it's not important. It's clear that there's an attack on the First Amendment. So if Trump is liable to go to jail for saying the election was rigged, who else is liable to go to jail for saying, what they're telling us about Ukraine and Russia is not right. There's something wrong about this. This is not accurate. They're lying to us. So they're setting up this whole scenario where if you go against the official government narrative, you're subject to prosecution. And that's certainly not the America that I want to live in.
So I think it goes back down to the changes. Yes, there's a little bit of improvement, with the Republicans in the House, but ultimately the people have to speak out. Just like the parents did speak out about COVID, and they served a very important function, and the people will have to speak out. But the First Amendment is very, very important to be able to express ourselves. You say, yeah, but there's too many controls on the internet, and this sort of thing is so difficult. Just think of the people that lived at the founding of this country. They had pamphlets that they run off a printing press by hand, and that was how they spread the messages, and it was a very successful way of spreading ideas, because it's the ideas that are so important, and it's key to getting those ideas off. Even when it's difficult, even under the worst systems like the Soviet system, there was still an expression, of what was really true, just as now. There's a large number of people who know exactly what's going on.